you think people would be willing to pay more if they knew it was made in America. I I I was raised by a father we were the last owners of a Zenith television because Zenith was the last TV that mostly had its parts made in America. Okay. Even then, and I remember, but at some point it became an impossibility to even do that.
Well, I think, to be clear, I think the sort of would you pay more for something made in America is not quite the right question to ask. It reminds me of, I live in Massachusetts, and when you file your taxes, there's a little checkbox you can check if you just want to pay a higher tax rate. And, unsurprisingly, not a lot of people check that
Most people don't
checkbox.
check that box. I know that's always an
Yeah,
amusing one,
not
right?
even people who believe that
Remember,
tax
we used
rate.
to have the contributing money to the presidential matching committee fund.
Sure.
That got a little bit more attention, but anyway.
The right way I think to think about it is that there's a much more fundamental trade-off going on between whether we want to have a robust industrial economy or
Mhm.
whether we want to just encourage our corporations to go elsewhere and send back the cheapest possible stuff. And so, yes, one implication of making a different choice in that regard would be that some things might cost more. But the choice you're making is not, well, I feel good about it saying made in America, so I will pay more. The trade-off you're making is about the basic kind of country that you want to have. And I think the best way to think about that trade-off is to recognize that we took one side of it back in, the 1990s and then 2000.
Mhm.
We said making things doesn't matter. Uh, we want the cheapest possible stuff, go. And we have now seen the results of that over the past few decades. And I think the vast majority of Americans are looking at that as an unwise choice. And so my claim is not that people want to pay more to feel good about a made in America label. It's
I think you
that
and I
they want
both
our.
know they may say that, even if they say it in a
That's
poll,
right. But that
they're
is
not
not
going
the
to behave that
question. The
way. Yeah,
question is that
consumers don't
what
behave that way.
trade-off do they want to make about the kind of nation we are?
Right.
And there, I think it's absolutely correct that most people regret the trade-off that was made and would like to see us making a different one.
So you believe you can still unwind this
Sure.
with how? Without too much damage to the economy. And I say this, like, how do you do it without, and let me give you an example. What happens to the Mercedes and BMW factories in the South? And what would happen to a foreign company that wants to make something here with in the way you would implement tariff policy?
Well, that's terrific. That's what we want more of. And again, that's where I think you put China to the side, where
Mhm.
we need to more be decoupling from China. We don't need China setting up its factories in the US. But the auto industry, I think, is actually probably the best illustration of what we're talking about here,
Mhm.
because you have a very concrete case study going back to the early 1980s when Ronald Reagan comes into office. And that's exactly when you had these, cheaper, smaller, more fuel efficient Japanese vehicles flooding the market, posing sort of a mortal challenge to the big three in Detroit. Now, what did Reagan do? Did he say, well, free trade is wonderful, so that's it. We're just not going to have an auto industry anymore. No, backed up by a very credible threat of tariffs coming from Congress.
Mhm.
Reagan negotiated with the Japanese, and the Japanese actually adopted what is called a voluntary export restraint. The Japanese said, this is not sustainable. We don't want to go down the path of trade war and tariffs that we're headed toward. We are going to tell our own producers, stop importing into the US market and go set up shop in the US instead.
Mhm.
And that is why Honda and Toyota and then Nissan moved into the American South, ultimately leading to, tens of billions of dollars in investment, hundreds of thousands of jobs. And now you have, yes, Japanese, nameplates on a lot of cars driving around in the US, but the Toyota Camry has more American-made content in it than a car from anybody coming, any of the
Mhm.
Detroit manufacturers. And so that I think is exactly what you see the Trump administration now trying to do with these negotiations, is say to these countries, look, this old system of you just produce and we just buy and
Mhm.
and you get back kind of ownership of the United States is over. Um, let's talk about what you guys can do to actually move us toward a balanced trading system. And Stephen Miran, who's the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, gave a very good speech a couple of weeks ago at the Hudson Institute, where he talked about exactly this set of things. This is a perfect example of what these countries can do is tell their corporations and use policy changes in their own countries to say, we understand we have reached the end of the road on this model because the US is not going to accept it anymore. Go invest in the United States. And just like the Japanese could build cars every bit as effectively with the same quality at the same price in the United States as they've been doing in Japan, there's all manner of things that we are currently buying from abroad that could instead be built in the United States. We're seeing it right now with chips. TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor, it's already committed about 65 billion in investment. They've just announced another 100 billion. The most fascinating thing is they've said so far the yield, the sort of quality and efficiency of their production in Arizona is higher than it is in Taiwan. So we can do these things. It's a question of whether it's the trade-off we want to make and the policy we want to pursue.
How about basically low cost manufacturing, right? Whether it's t-shirts or trinkets or whatever you want to look at. But I want you to answer that question. There's a lot of small business owners that are American business owners where they order most of their, here's an American business whose most of their inventory comes from Asia. But they're paying American taxes, all of those things. They're going to get hurt. And a lot of these businesses are going to go under because they really don't have an alternative. Even if there's eventually an alternative way for them to stay in business, right now they're not. Right? It's the shock. They're our supply chains are really efficient and all of this stuff. What happens to that sort of low cost manufacturing product and the hundreds of thousands of small businesses that are counting on that inventory coming from Asia?
Well, I guess I would separate a couple of different issues there. One is I totally agree that you need that phase-in period. You need to give companies a time to adjust. And that's why I say, high tariffs on day one, yes, that causes some of those disruptions.
By the way, are you concerned that your idea here is going to get drowned by poor implementation?
That is a sort of endemic risk in policy, in the policy wonkery I have chosen to engage in for my career. Right. I'm always on one hand hesitant. I think you always have to accept imperfect implementation. I think
politicians are imperfect by nature.
That's right. The guy who kind of publishes his white papers and then says like, oh, well, that's not exactly what was in the white paper, therefore I disown it. I don't have a lot of time for. On the flip side, I do think when you're at the level of sort of the core concepts of what are we trying to do here, especially in this sort of situation, you have to get the balance of costs and benefits right. Because I think the right way to think about this ultimately is we're talking about an investment. We're talking about what kinds of costs should we incur in the short run because we think it is going to pay dividends in terms of something better in the long run. And when you're doing that, and whether, in the private sector as well, if you're thinking about an investment, whether you keep the costs low up front and whether you deliver those high benefits in the long run is what determines whether you're happy with the investment or not. And so here, I think the right way to understand the risk or the concern is that if you pursue the policy in a way that adds a lot of unnecessary costs up front, and if you do it in a way that does not deliver as many benefits in the long run, because you don't create the certainty, and so you don't get the investment, then it's just, you're not going to be happy with the trade-off. And so I think even the way the Trump administration has implemented things so far, you can get some of that reshoring. You can get things brought back to the United States. But the way that I hope people will think about it, and I'm encouraged to see the administration increasingly thinking about it, is to recognize that whether or not you're happy with the deal at the end of the day, whether or not it was a good policy to pursue, depends on whether you do it in a way that keeps those costs down and that maximizes those benefits.